Did you know that Daniel Craig's final James Bond film, No Time to Die, achieved something unprecedented in the franchise's 59-year history? It earned $774 million worldwide and received largely positive reviews, yet simultaneously created the biggest fan revolt in Bond history. For the first time since Dr. No premiered in 1962, audiences walked out of a Bond film knowing that 007 was definitively, unquestionably dead. What makes this even more shocking is that killing Bond was not a last-minute creative decision born from desperation or production problems. According to Craig himself, he'd been planning Bond's death since 2006's Casino Royale, asking producer Barbara Broccoli during their initial meetings if he could kill off the character if he completed all 5 films. She said yes, and 15 years later, they followed through on that promise in the most definitive way possible, complete with falling church bells, ominous foreshadowing, and Blofeld's warning that Madeleine's secret would be the death of you. So, why did a creative decision meant to provide closure and emotional weight instead spark debates that continue to rage 3 years later? Today, we're examining how No Time to Die's bold ending may have fundamentally broken something essential about what makes James Bond work as a character. The sacred contract, Bond's invincibility. From the moment Sean Connery first introduced himself as Bond, James Bond, in 1962, the character has embodied something unique in cinema. Absolute invincibility wrapped in sophisticated charm. Bond does not just survive impossible situations, he makes survival look effortless, stylish, and enjoyable. Whether he's escaping Goldfinger's laser table with a perfectly timed quip, ejecting from an Aston Martin seconds before it explodes, or walking away from helicopter crashes that should liquefy a human being, Bond's survival is not just expected, it's kind of the foundation of the whole franchise. This invincibility served a crucial psychological function that the filmmakers of No Time to Die fundamentally misunderstood. Bond represented the ultimate fantasy that skill, wit, style, and determination could overcome any obstacle. He was wish fulfillment personified. The man who always had a backup plan, always knew exactly what to do, and always found a way to turn desperate situations to his advantage. The pattern was so consistent that it became ritualized. No matter how dire the villain's scheme, how elaborate the death trap, or how overwhelming the odds, audiences knew that Bond would find his way out. This was not lazy storytelling, it was sophisticated comfort food that provided exactly what audiences needed. The pleasure came not from wondering if Bond would survive, but from discovering how he would survive, usually in the most impossibly clever way imaginable. No Time to Die shattered that fundamental contract with audiences. When those Royal Navy missiles struck Saffin's Island and the screen cut to black, it was not just Daniel Craig's Bond who died. It was the entire myth of Bond's invincibility that had sustained the franchise for 6 decades. Director Cary Fukunaga and the writing team made a calculated decision to prioritize a single moment of emotional shock over the character's essential appeal. The death itself was crafted to be as definitive and inescapable as possible. Bond's not gunned down by a henchman or caught in an explosion where survival might be plausible. He's deliberately infected with Heracles nanobots programmed to kill Madeleine and their daughter Matilda upon physical contact, making his survival literally equivalent to a death sentence for his family. When the missiles obliterate the island, there's no ambiguity, no last-second escape hatch, no clever technical solution. Bond is vaporized along with everything else. Daniel Craig's personal agenda versus character legacy. Understanding why Bond had to die requires examining Daniel Craig's unique and ultimately problematic relationship with a character he portrayed for 15 years. Unlike previous Bond actors who largely treated each film as a standalone adventure with minimal continuity, Craig approached his entire tenure as one massive, interconnected character arc that would build toward a predetermined ending he'd planned from the very beginning. This approach fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the Bond character and franchise. James Bond is not just Daniel Craig's character. He's a cultural icon that belongs to generations of fans who've invested emotionally in his adventures since 1962. The character is bigger than any single actor's interpretation, which is why the franchise successfully survived the transitions from Connery to Lazenby to Moore to Dalton to Brosnan. Craig's decision to kill Bond was deeply personal and entirely selfish from a franchise perspective. In post-release interviews, he's been remarkably candid about his motivations, explaining that Bond's death served 2 primary purposes. First, it allowed the franchises to completely reset for the next actor, and second, it gave him personal psychological closure so he could move on without the temptation to return for more films. This was not about serving the character, the story, or the future of the franchise. It was about serving Craig's emotional needs. The problem becomes clear when you consider that Craig had already achieved what he wanted by the end of Spectre. His Bond had found love, defeated his greatest enemies, and walked away from the spy life to happily live with Madeleine Swann. That ending provided all the closure any reasonable person could want. Bringing Bond back just to kill him represents a fundamental failure to understand when a story is actually finished. More troubling is how Craig's personal agenda influenced the entire production. By his own admission, he'd been planning Bond's death since Casino Royale, which means every subsequent film was building toward an ending that prioritized Craig's desire for finality over the franchise's long-term health. This explains many of the structural problems with the Craig era: the increasingly convoluted mythology, the obsession with past trauma, the growing emphasis on Bond's emotional damage rather than his capabilities. Craig's Bond was always different from his predecessors in ways that should have served as warning signs. Where Sean Connery's Bond was confident and unflappable, Roger Moore's was charming and resourceful, and Pierce Brosnan's was sophisticated and deadly. Craig's version was haunted, vulnerable, and increasingly defined by loss rather than triumph. By No Time to Die, Craig's Bond had become so weighed down by emotional baggage that death felt like the only possible escape. Not because the story demanded it, but because the character had been written into a psychological corner where happiness seemed impossible. The Family Man Fallacy. One of No Time to Die's most fundamental and perhaps damaging missteps was transforming James Bond from a sophisticated lone wolf operative into a domestic family man. The film's emotional climax depends entirely on audiences caring deeply about Bond's relationship with Madeleine Swann and their daughter Matilda. But this transformation completely misunderstands what makes Bond appealing as a character and fantasy figure. James Bond has always been defined by his freedom and independence. He forms connections, professional relationships with allies like Felix Leiter, romantic entanglements with various women, respectful bonds with authority figures like M, and friendships with colleagues like Q and Moneypenny. But these connections never fundamentally compromise his independence or effectiveness as an agent. Bond's ability to operate without emotional baggage or long-term commitments is essential to his function as both a spy and a fantasy figure for audiences. The appeal of Bond has always been vicarious. Audiences live through his adventures, his sophistication, his competence, and yes, his freedom from the mundane responsibilities that weigh down ordinary people. Bond does not worry about mortgages, relationships, or family obligations because he exists in a realm of pure adventure and capability. Making him a father figure doesn't add depth to the character, it fundamentally changes who he is in ways that make him less appealing rather than more relatable. The domestic scenes in No Time to Die feel like they belong in a completely different movie. Bond teaching Matilda to make breakfast, complete with catching a falling apple and flipping pancakes with paternal warmth, is so far removed from the character audiences know and love that it's almost surreal. This is not the sophisticated spy who orders vodka martinis shaken not stirred and seduces enemy agents in Monte Carlo casinos. This is a suburban dad character wearing 007's clothes. Even more problematic is how the film handles Bond's discovery that he's a father. The scene where Madeleine reveals Matilda's parentage should be a massive emotional moment, but it lands with a thud because the relationship feels forced and underdeveloped. Bond and Matilda have minimal screen time together before his death, yet audiences are expected to believe that their connection is strong enough to justify his ultimate sacrifice. This transformation culminates in Bond's final decision to stay on Saffin's Island rather than risk infecting his family with the nanobots. While his choice is emotionally logical within the film's contrived narrative, it represents a complete betrayal of the character's core appeal and capabilities. The Bond of previous films, even Craig's earlier portrayals, would have found a third option. He would have devised a clever technological solution, discovered an unexpected ally, or worked with MI6 to engineer a last-second scientific breakthrough. Instead, No Time to Die presents a Bond who simply accepts death as his only option. This is not heroic, it's defeatist. For 24 previous films, Bond's defining characteristic was his ability to find impossible solutions to impossible problems. Making him a father figure who meekly accepts death as inevitable diminishes everything that made the character special and aspirational. The Broken Promise of Escapism. Bond films have always served a specific and crucial function in popular culture. They provide glamorous, high-stakes escapism that allow audiences to live vicariously through the adventures of the world's most competent and sophisticated man. People do not go to Bond movies to confront mortality, process grief, or grapple with the psychological consequences of violence. They go to watch a master at work, operating at the peak of human capability while maintaining perfect style, confidence, and control. This escapist function is not frivolous, it's essential to the franchise's appeal and cultural significance. In a world of uncertainty, responsibility, and mundane problems, Bond represents a fantasy of absolute competence and freedom. He's the man who always knows what to do, always looks good doing it, and always wins in the end. This consistency provides genuine psychological comfort and inspiration for audiences who face their own daily struggles and limitations. No Time to Die violates this unspoken contract with audiences in the most brutal way possible. Instead of leaving the theater feeling empowered, entertained, and energized, the way audiences should feel after a Bond film, fans walked out processing genuine grief and loss. The film's final scenes, featuring Madeleine tearfully telling Matilda stories about her dead father while driving through the countryside, read more like a funeral service than a celebration of the character's legacy. The consistent structure of Bond films have been refined over 6 decades to provide maximum satisfaction. An exciting pre-title sequence, a briefing with M, innovative gadgets from Q, exotic locations, a charismatic villain with an elaborate scheme, spectacular action sequences, and Bond's inevitable triumph. This formula works because it provides exactly what audiences want from the experience: vicarious adventure, sophisticated wish fulfillment, and the reassurance that good will triumph over evil through skill, determination, and creativity. By killing Bond, No Time to Die betrayed that trust in ways that continues to reverberate throughout the fanbase. Longtime enthusiasts who expected to leave the theater energized and excited about future adventures instead found themselves mourning a character they'd loved for decades. The film prioritized surprise and emotional manipulation over the fundamental entertainment value that has sustained the franchise through multiple actors, directors, and cultural changes. The aftermath has been particularly telling about the damage done to the franchise's relationship with its core audience. While many professional critics praised No Time to Die's bold storytelling choices and emotional depth, fan communities remain deeply divided 3 years after its release. Perhaps most damaging is the number of fans who have stated they won't see future Bond films, feeling that the franchise has fundamentally lost what made it special and trustworthy: structural failings that undermine the ending. No Time to Die's problem extends beyond just the controversial ending. The film suffers from significant structural issues that make Bond's death feel unearned and manipulative, rather than the natural conclusion of a compelling story. The most glaring problem is Rami Malek's Safin, who represents one of the weakest villains in Bond history. Despite Malek's considerable talent, Safin lacks the charisma, clear motivation, and narrative weight necessary to feel like a genuine threat worthy of Bond's ultimate sacrifice. His plan involving Heracles nanobots is technically impressive, but emotionally vacant, and his personal vendetta against Spectre doesn't provide sufficient foundation for the film's climactic events. More critically, Safin's motivations remain frustratingly vague and contradictory throughout the film. He wants revenge against Spectre for killing his family, a clear goal, but then he also wants to use the nanobots for selective genocide on a global scale, which feels like a completely different character with different objectives. The film never adequately explains how this personal revenge evolved into world-threatening megalomania, leaving audiences with a villain who feels like 2 different characters awkwardly stitched together. Even more damaging is the film's mishandling of Ernst Stavro Blofeld, one of Bond's most iconic adversaries. Christoph Waltz's return to the role promised a climactic showdown between Bond and his greatest nemesis, but instead, Blofeld is dispatched in a brief, anticlimactic prison scene that serves only to advance Safin's plot. Killing off such a legendary villain in such an offhanded manner demonstrates shocking disregard for the franchise's history. The film's pacing creates additional problems that prevent audiences from fully investing in either the action sequences or the emotional moments. The early sequences in Matera, Jamaica, and Cuba showcase everything that makes Bond films special: exotic locations, innovative action choreography, and Craig's charismatic performance. But these highlights make the film's slower, more introspective segments feel like padding from a different movie entirely. The Precedent Problem. By definitively killing Bond, No Time to Die creates unprecedented problems for future installments. The film's ending makes it impossible for the next Bond movie to simply recast the role and continue as the franchise has done successfully for 6 decades. The traditional Bond formula has always been elegantly simple when it comes to recasting. Each new actor simply becomes James Bond without elaborate explanation. Audiences understood instinctively that they were seeing the same character portrayed by a different performer. This approach worked seamlessly through transitions from Connery to Lazenby to Moore to Dalton to Brosnan. No Time to Die destroys this elegant system by making Bond's death so definitive that future films cannot simply ignore it. The next Bond movie will be forced to address how James Bond is alive again, opening the door to increasingly ridiculous explanations that could turn the franchise into science fiction rather than sophisticated spy adventure. The most likely solution, a complete reboot that ignores the Craig era entirely, creates its own problems. It means that Craig's 5 films exist in isolation, disconnected from both what came before and what comes after. This undermines the continuity that the Craig era worked to establish, while making those films feel less important in the history of the franchise. Having someone else take the Bond codename, as the film hints with Lashana Lynch's Nomi becoming 007, fundamentally changes what the character represents. Bond's appeal isn't just his job title, it's his specific personality, history, relationships, and approach to his work. Having someone else become James Bond might work for a single film, but it wouldn't satisfy fans who want to see the actual James Bond character return. The creative corner. Perhaps most frustratingly, Bond's death feels like a solution to a problem the filmmakers created for themselves. The Craig era's emphasis on continuity and character development gradually painted the series into a corner, where traditional Bond storytelling became increasingly difficult. By the end of Spectre, Bond had seemingly achieved everything the character could reasonably accomplish. He defeated Spectre, captured Blofeld, and found love with Madeleine Swan. The film ends with Bond walking away from the spy life, a conclusion that provided complete emotional closure. Bringing Bond back just to kill him represents a failing to understand when a story might be finished. The Craig era's problems stemmed from a misguided belief that continuity and character development were inherently superior to the episodic structure that had served the franchise well for decades. Instead of recognizing that Bond works best as a consistent character who faces new challenges, the filmmakers became obsessed with changing him in ways that ultimately made him less appealing. The irony is that many of No Time to Die's individual elements work brilliantly. Daniel Craig delivers what may be his finest performance as Bond. The action sequences rank among the best in franchise history, and the technical aspects are impressive. But these successes are undermined by an ending that betrays the fundamental appeal of the character and franchise. No Time to Die succeeded in creating one of the most emotionally devastating endings in action cinema history, but it did so by destroying something irreplaceable about one of popular culture's most enduring icons. James Bond's invincibility was not just a character trait, it was a sacred promise to audiences that skill, style, intelligence, and determination could overcome any obstacle, no matter how impossible it might seem. But hey, that's just our opinion. What do you think about Bond's death in No Time to Die? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into Hollywood's biggest franchise decisions and creative controversies. This video is made by movie fans for movie fans.